I'm Anthea Hancock, the CEO of the Scanlon Foundation Research Institute, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are each attending and pay my respects to their elders past and present and to all First Peoples. Thank you all for joining this conversation and for your interest in this topic and our most recent narrative. Already we've received quite a number of questions that you all shared when you registered, and we will use those questions, but also any questions that you put into the chat as we get going through this discussion. And we'll try to get to as many of them as we possibly can. I'm sure you're all aware that this session is being recorded, and we will help everyone, we'll keep everybody on mute to create the best environment for those speaking and those listening. For those who have not already accessed it, the narrative can be found on the Scanlon Institute website. Before I introduce the author of the narrative and our panelists, the purpose of today's session is to consider the necessity and possible methods to bring secondary schools and the community closer. This has numerous benefits, but essentially it fosters in young people a sense of belonging to their neighbourhoods and society. It encourages a village environment for youth, parents, and civil society to harness the benefits of collaborative thinking and solutions. It says everyone should have a voice, and it promotes cross-cultural familiarity and awareness of the strengths that everybody brings. Some of you may be familiar with the work of the Scanlon Foundation's association with Community Hubs Australia. Following the significant impact that they have had in their communities has led us to consider how we can bring the community closer into secondary schools, where the academic emphasis can obscure the need to create a well-rounded, engaged and contributing experience for students, parents and their communities. These are not the only models or benefits, as we will hear. So let me first introduce our speakers and panelists. John Ross is the author of the narrative, and John is the Asia Pacific editor of the Times Higher Education magazine. He was previously science correspondent at the Australian newspaper, and he's won several awards from the National Press Club for his reporting on higher education. Little known facts about John is that he swims in the ocean every day, drinks too much coffee apparently, and plays Galician bagpipes quite badly, so he says. He's once auditioned unsuccessfully to be a Spanish-speaking wiggle. So, John, some information most of us don't know about you, but he's also our keynote speaker and the author of the narrative, as I said, the narrative being, could secondary schools be the key to better connecting communities and neighbourhoods? Professor Janet Clinton is the Deputy Dean, University of Melbourne at the Graduate School of Education. Janet is the Director of the Teacher and Teaching Effectiveness Research Hub at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education, Australia. She has wide national and international experience as an evaluator and educator with an extensive publication record and a broad teaching profile. Janet has worked in Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, which will be very useful because one of the questions we received was to do with international examples, and has been a principal investigator on many large complex evaluations and research projects. She's chief investigator, though, and most relevantly, on the Building Connections Schools as Community Hubs ARC linkage project. Her team is investigating how to plan, design, govern and manage facilities and infrastructure to enable schools to operate successfully as more than a school and foster the development of resilient and connected communities. And finally, I'm delighted that Harold Cozier, who's the principal at the Wollongong Public School, has been able to join us. Harold established a community hub 4 years ago at Wollongong Public School and was interviewed by John for the narrative. Only 40% of students at Wollongong Public School are native English speakers. To help with the transition, they established a Beginning School Well program, a 5-week program where caregivers attend and learn about the role in helping their children transition. Harold believes some of his secondary school counterparts would jump at the opportunity to host community hubs. We certainly hope so, due to the loss of connection already established with parents when students move from primary school into secondary school, and the need for ongoing communication. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome everybody to this session, and of course to all of those people that are here listening. And now I'd like to turn it over to John to give us the keynote component of this webinar. So John, over to you.
Oh, thanks very much, Anthea. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the area where I live, beautiful coastal area of Sydney. The Gadigal people have done a remarkable job of looking after this part of the country. It's lovely. And also big thanks to Scanlon Institute for inviting me to talk about this project. My expertise, such as it is in higher education and international education. Don't know that much about schools. So this project was a real eye-opener for me, visiting the schools, hosting community hubs, the Community Hubs Australia and Scanlon supported hubs in 4 different states. And the thing that really stood out to me was the engagement that I was seeing at these places. I mean, underplaying it a bit, I guess, probably the thing that stood out even more was the real sense of heart that these places had, the emotional connection between the schools and the communities. But in terms of the way of the benefits that these community hubs brought to the schools, I'd have to say it's engagement. I think it's fairly well documented what the community hubs do for the people who participate in them, who are primarily migrant women, also migrant kids, sometimes migrant men, and sometimes Australian born. I guess I was more interested in what the community hubs did for the schools. And to me, it really comes back to engagement. There are obviously other benefits for the schools, particularly with some of the preschool-aged kids who get their grounding in the schools by visiting the community hubs, that when they finally arrive at big school, they're really ready for it. And I think that's a huge, tremendous benefit to the schools. There's many benefits along those lines. The hubs actually provide quite almost a circular workforce for the schools. A lot of the participants in hubs end up working in the schools. So many benefits, but to me, it comes back to engagement. That's what I really saw. The schools, maybe they're really, really special schools. I suspect they are, at least some of the schools that I visited, but they really knew their communities. They have an ethos that to really do the best for the kids, they need to know their families, they need to know their communities. And that's what was happening at the schools that hosted community hubs. To quote Julie Murphy, who's principal of Elizabeth Vale Primary School in Northern Adelaide, the more we understand the family, the more we support our mums and dads, the better our kids will learn. So it's absolute core business for people like Julie. So obviously the question kept occurring to me, could this sense of really, really rich engagement be replicated in high schools? Because really the Community Hubs Australia program is, to all intents and purposes, a primary school-based program. There's a handful of community hubs based in schools that might be prep to 7, prep to 9, even I think an aspirant prep to 12 school. But even those schools really saw it as a primary school thing. And when I spoke to the community hub coordinators about this, they were very quick to talk about why community hubs work so well in primary schools. So one of the big things they talked about was the school gate thing. So you have a real point of engagement at the school gate, parents bringing their kids to the school or dropping them off. They mill around, they talk to each other. It's a chance for the school and the community hub people to engage with these parents. There's your entry, away you go. Really important to the way that community hubs work in primary schools. Also, I guess the sense that kids don't really need, high school kids don't need to be walked to school like that. They don't need that level of care. And more to the point, most adolescent kids wouldn't be seen dead out in public with their parents. So obviously the model's not going to work in the same way. And there's other logistical issues. primary schools tend to be closer to people's homes, often in walking distance. Often it could be a drive or a bus ride or a train ride or whatever. For a high school, parents of high school kids are more likely to be working because they have more opportunity to do that, so less opportunity to engage. And high schools are just kind of bigger, noisier, more complicated places, harder for local parents to get a handle on. But they might even find them a bit intimidating. You've got all these sort of big, buffy 15, 16, 17-year-olds running around with basketballs and bum fluff. And, you know, that might be a bit harder for people to feel comfortable in than the kind of relatively sedate atmosphere, I guess, of a primary school. So as I was speaking to the community hubs people, they were bringing all this up, you know, why it works so well in the primary school setting. But at the same time, I got this sense that there was this light going on kind of behind their eyes. So they're thinking the needs that the community has for the needs that are met through community hubs in primary schools, they all exist for the parents of high school kids. The need to get a foot in the labour market, to improve your English, to make, you know, good, really rich relationships across the cultural spectrum of your local community, and to understand, if you're a newcomer to Australia, to understand the great mysteries of Australian life, like the Mikey card, or you know, how the health system works, Centrelink, which I think are a really big issue for a lot of migrants, getting their heads around that. It's hard enough for people who are born here. So those problems, they exist very much for people who arrive in Australia with kids who are high school aged, as for those who arrive with much younger children. There's no difference there. And arguably, the problems that community hubs address in schools are even more acute in high schools. Things like that sense of disconnect that you sometimes get between the community and the school, I think it's elevated at the high school level. The sense of disconnect you get within families is elevated because you get this kind of divergent skills in languages. You might even have grandparents who only speak the home country language, and kids who, to all intents and purposes, only can or only will speak English. So you get this huge disconnect even within families. And I think you get this sense of helplessness amongst some parents because the content of what's being learnt at school is more difficult. So it's much harder for the parents to help their kids with their homework. Obviously, that's something a homework club might address. And then the need for, you know, those really rewarding relationships, that's there for high school parents. So all of this was occurring to the community hub coordinators that I was talking to, even as they were sort of emphasising why community hubs were primary school things. So it was almost like before my eyes, at least with some of them, they were becoming advocates for community hubs in high schools. And as a journalist, it's not my job to be an advocate. My job's to research, observe, report dispassionately, leave it to other people to work out the policy implications. But my research certainly suggests that this is a question worth asking. And there are counter arguments, of course, because schools are really overloaded in lots of ways. There's crowded curriculum. They're forever being asked to jam more things into the curriculum, from responsible relationships to road safety, all very worthwhile things, but schools can't do everything. They just don't have the time, and more to the point, their staff, the teachers, those constantly overworked teachers don't have the time to do everything. And the more you bring the community into the school, or the more you bring the school into the community, the more you have to worry about kind of safety and jurisdictional issues. So as an example, with community gardens, if you locate a community garden in a school, then you might have sort of safety issues that you have to worry about with certain people coming onto the school grounds to tend the community garden. And some people might have red flags next to their name. It might just be an unpaid parking fine, which for some people in the community can be something that's pretty hard to clear. So you get these jurisdictional issues that might just make things more complicated. But you also get the benefits that I've also mentioned, and some bigger picture benefits. One of the things that people kept on talking to me about was the parents and citizens associations at a lot of the schools. There's fantastic organisations, but I think it's two issues. One is there's a waning of volunteering in the community. We've really seen that in the aftermath of COVID and I guess now cost of living crisis. People have less time to devote to things like the P&C associations. And also, to a large extent, P&C associations are a creature of white Australia. Some of the migrant communities just don't relate to them to that particular form of infrastructure and way of communicating. They don't relate to it all that well. So community hubs are another way to do this. They're another way of engaging people with the school, really getting the parents and citizens involved. And there's also the whole sense of the community, sense of ownership of the school. And as a New South Welshman, I'm always really struck when I go to Victoria, particularly on the weekends, and you see the schools are these real vibrant activities of family get-together spaces, kicking balls, having picnics, all this sort of thing. In New South Wales, we can't do that because the schools are locked and there's signs talking about the Enclosed Spaces Act, a different philosophy to how the community should relate to the school. Basically don't come on the weekends or after hours. I suspect there's real security benefits in that Victorian, that more open approach. I haven't seen data one way or the other, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if things like arson, vandalism, things like that are less prevalent in these schools where the community has more opportunity to engage and more sense of ownership. And then there's an even bigger issue about productive use of infrastructure, particularly as our cities get more and more crowded, open land becomes scarcer. Can we really afford not to have, not to be giving the community the maximum benefit of public facilities like schools, particularly, with land as a premium? I mean, that does happen to an extent. They're used for after hours childcare, adult and community education classes and things like that. But I'm sure there can be a hell of a lot more of this sort of stuff, and community hubs is one way it can happen. And then the string of disasters we've all grappled with over the last few years, fires, COVID, obviously, floods, hailstorms. I think schools have really come to the fore in this environment that we've been enduring as places where information is distributed. And even as places of refuge in some towns. So they have this really important function. And with the way the climate's going, I think you'd have to be really optimistic to think that the need for schools to fulfill that sort of function is going to diminish anytime soon. So there's a lot of arguments for this sort of idea of broadening the community hubs concept into secondary schools. So what does the evidence tell us? It's mixed about community hubs, but the broader issue of parental engagement in kids' schooling, there's lots and lots of evidence that that's really beneficial, and the benefits can be seen in terms of academic marks, retention rates, and things like that. The US in particular has decades of longitudinal evidence about that sort of stuff. But when you sort of talk about the more diffuse and kind of two-way engagement that you get with community hubs, the evidence is it's harder to tease out. That's partly because community hubs are pretty new, and partly because the people, well, the principals really, who are prepared to take on things like community hubs, often also have a lot of other innovative things happening at their schools. So if you start to see improvements in academic results, it's hard to pin things down. Wollongong Public School Principal Harold Cozier, who you're all about to meet pretty soon as the panelist today, when I visited him, he was talking about how the community hub was crucial to what he was doing to his school, absolutely fundamental. But I really got the sense that he was fundamental to what was happening in the school too. The sense of engagement and openness that he was really cultivating didn't end at the community hub. So the benefits that his school is seeing are going to be hard to tease out. It's going to be hard to know what you can shoot back to community hub and hard to know what other innovations might deserve the credit. But the evidence base is about to explode, largely because of a proliferation of what are known as community schools in the United States. These things have been around for quite a few years. There are literally thousands of them. They're certainly not limited to primary or elementary schools, but there's been a real surge in them in the last few years. California's getting into them in a really, really big way, put billions of dollars into it. So you're going to see a lot of researchers testing this whole concept, seeing what's happening and what results are coming from these sorts of initiatives. New York's been bankrolling this sort of stuff in a big way for a few more years, so it's had a bit of time to do some serious research on it, and the initial results of that are quite promising. I'll go into that a little bit in the narrative. And the former New York mayor, Bill de Blasio, he said he was on a mission to no longer let zip code determine academic success, and community schools were helping him to deliver on that personal mission. Now, our current federal education minister, Jason Clare, he uses very much the same sort of language. He doesn't talk about zip code, he'll talk about postcode. But fundamentally, he's talking about not letting the circumstances of people's birth or upbringing dictate the opportunity that they have in life. And he's talking about that at all levels of education. So I think there's clearly a lot of interest in this broad issue of communities' involvement in schools and schools' involvement in community. It's growing, and it really makes sense for Australia to be part of that conversation. So I'm looking forward to the conversation today. Thanks, and back to you, Anthea.
Thank you very much, John. That's really a terrific introduction and a great overview of the narrative. So I very much appreciate you taking the time to sort of flesh that out for everybody. I thought we might just start by asking both Janet and Harold whether or not what your response is to this, and perhaps come at it from the direction of your particular area of expertise. So if you wouldn't mind just letting us, just introducing us to you and to your thoughts and what you think we should be taking away from this particular type of thinking. So Janet, I might turn to you first.
Okay, thank you. Well, I have to congratulate John for his great overview. As some of you might know from Anthea's introduction, we've been involved in the research that sits behind schools as community hubs. And my role has really been looking at the evidence. So I think what you've really done is highlighted the notion that schools engaging with communities, schools that define themselves as a community hub is a fantastic idea. Can't argue with it, really can't. And I think schools, if I'm honest, it's their role to be a part of community. Now, whether you're a hub or whether you're engaged in community, it's a long continuum is what I've suggested to you. And that really impacts on the evidence that we have. And as I think John's pointed out, there are pockets of great evidence that show impact that we've had for many, many years, even in the Australian context, in the UK context, definitely in the US context. So my question would be, though, when you look at it overall, why is it not every school does define themselves at that big end of school as community hub? And why is it that in some places we don't actually see the impact on our whole community that you would imagine? I think one of the things we have to dig into.
I think, Janet, you might be one of the people to provide an answer to that. But Harold, I guess you probably connect with some of the issues about whether or not this sort of broader community engagement may or may not work in secondary schools. But as I mentioned before, you certainly think that high schools would jump at the opportunity to do more of this. I'd be really interested if you could talk a little bit about your experience, and then what do you think are the opportunities for this to happen in the high school environment?
Thank you, Anthea, and thank you, John, and thank you for the kind words as well, John. And I'd like to acknowledge I'm on Dharawal country this afternoon. There was a lot in John's presentation that resonates with our situation, our school, our community. We come from a position where we actually see ourselves as a village. And we use that terminology when we welcome people into the school, that we actually articulate that we believe that it takes a village to raise a child, and we extend it to it takes a village to educate a child, that our families are very much part of that model. Interestingly, I've been here for quite a few years now, and we only got our big black security fences in 2016. We are in the middle of Wollongong CBD, so we're an inner city school in a regional area. This is the quietest school I've ever worked in terms of vandalism, in terms of criminal activity. And a big part of that is the community owns us. All of our community really recognise that we belong to them, and so they keep an eye out. We actually have the police stations not that far away, and those on night shift park in our car parks. That helps. They see it as part of, they love us, so they keep an eye out. But our local homeless people respect that this is a school, that they need to look after it. We have occasional visitors who will camp. They are gone long before the kids come. They clean up after themselves. They make sure it's tidy. So the philosophy for us goes very wide. And back to your question of leading into high schools, the bulk of my students feed into Keira High, and so they are a very multicultural school like we are. And I've been talking with my principal colleague there, and we've been looking at just what would be involved and what it would look like. He absolutely believes that the connections that we build here, if we can maintain those for those families and those kids as they move into high school, that would be a real bonus. He talked about the disconnect that happens particularly for the boys. They are struggling with forming an identity as a young man in a whole new environment where they don't know everyone, because even though we're a school of 500, the kids all know each other. They're going into a school of 1,000 plus, and they've got to develop and belong to a whole new set of codes. And some of those can be pretty questionable. And and when that happens and the school has to make contact with families, it's horrible if the first contact is your child is in trouble.
Absolutely, Harold. I'm just curious though, what do you think the elements would be within a high school that had embraced this type of approach that would help to ameliorate that? What's the thing that you think would build that connectivity?
Relationships. We highly value relationships, as does my secondary colleague, if we can, and we talked about not having the hub on site, because one of the things about our hub is it's right in the middle of the school, and it's deliberately like that, so that the preschoolers who come to the hub already know all about our school. They know where the classrooms are, all of that stuff. But it also means that the families recognise that they are welcome, that they belong inside the school. And John mentioned about the school gate and the congregation at the school gate. For us, it's actually going past the school gate and into the school, so that they belong. It also gives them a conduit into enabling them to ask questions about how's it work, because so many of those families have no idea how Australian education works. And they don't want to get it wrong. And it's just like those kids going into high school. They don't want to get it wrong, but they don't want to get it wrong for the school, their peers. So they've got a whole lot of things that they're juggling. If we can ease that by enabling parents to have a conduit into the high school, so that they're making a connection with people in the high school where they know they can ask questions and not get it wrong and not feel ashamed, embarrassed, it makes it so much easier.
Yeah, I think that connectivity and communications is important, but Janet, what you don't want is for this simply to become, a mass information desk where parents are dropping in at any time and just asking questions and keeping an eye on their students. This concept that we're talking about is more than that. This is actually about utilising the brains that are in schools as well as the brains in the community to work collaboratively together on whether it's joint projects or whether it's to do with activities more broadly within the community. Do you have some thoughts from your research as to what are some of the elements that need to be in place to make this type of relationship work?
I think there's a really critical one that what we have to think about with schools. And I love, Harold, that you and John, we've talked about the gate at the front, and that's for all schools. I understand New South Wales. I have grandchildren in New South Wales and in Victoria, and I noticed the difference in the gates and the fences. So one of the things that we've learned, and it is I want to say an old concept, is the idea that the school needs to be an inviting place. Education needs to be inviting. William Perky, in this would have been in the 80s, said, had a big push through the US about invitational schools and inviting education. And it is getting past that gate, getting past the front desk and understanding the language of schooling. And I think that's what we've learned from our project, is that schools have different levels of barrier for the community. And for many of our community members, we also know that those big buildings, particularly for secondary schools and the big stack of schools, they're a bit scary. And just being able to understand the language, understand the organisational structure of schools as a parent, let alone a student, is really difficult. So I think, again, all schools, it's their role to be a part of the community and engage. End of story.
Yeah.
But the readiness of the school to engage at the level that Harold and John are talking about is variable. The needs of the community is very variable. And when you get into secondary school, it's not that some of the problems are harder or worse, or however you want to describe it, but they're very different. So if you think about our secondary schools at the moment, we all have the task of reducing school non-attending, school refusers. It's massive at the moment. So that means that education for our secondary school students is going to be will have a generational effect if we don't do something about that for those students. So it's more than the idea. It is about those organisational factors, and our research has demonstrated the variability of school need, of school readiness, and willingness, perhaps motivation of some of our schools and our communities to really join up at the level that we're talking at.
So we might go to some of the questions that were mentioned that people submitted before the actual session started. And one of them is, what are the next steps to have more connected schools? So what's some of and in actual fact, what would help convince schools of the value? So perhaps that is the first step, is to ensure that the school actually understands the value of a more connected school. But would any of you like to address what you think the first steps might be for schools to go down this path? Harold, would you like to kick that off?
Are you talking in terms of just generally schools connecting through community hubs, or are you talking
not through community hubs, but if you were a secondary school, how do you go about having the conversation within that secondary school of what the value is of expanding their relationships, if you like, and then moving along the pathway?
From my point of view, it's actually celebrating the successes that we've had in establishing our community hub. Because I've been here about a dozen years, for well over the first half of that time, I had a massive population of fringe dwellers, families that just weren't engaged, they didn't have language, they didn't know how to approach, I didn't know how to approach them. And so the conversation would be hello, hello, and smile, and that was it. Community Hub has meant that we no longer have that. We now have a huge group of families who know there's a point of contact where they will be welcome. They know that our school as a whole is a welcoming place. They know that they can ask questions around their children's education, around expectations, and that it is safe to do that.
Mm-hmm.
They have that security of knowing there's no shame in asking those questions, and it means they are so much more confident in supporting their kids in our school. And it just has a ripple effect through the engagement in learning, the celebration of language and prior knowledge, and the knowledge of how things work.
Yeah,
that's really powerful.
absolutely. So, John, I've given you a bit of a break, but have you got any thoughts about how do you think within a secondary school environment they should express the value of this greater community engagement?
I imagine it's going to be a learning process, and I mean, secondary schools are only autonomous to a degree anyway. That they exist within a bureaucracy, which exists within a political structure. So the schools don't necessarily have complete autonomy to do these sorts of things anyway. I think an evidence base will help. And I think people like Harold, and I'm sure this is already happening, people like Harold and many of the other principals that I met, chatting to their colleagues in secondary schools, that will help. And then those sorts of conversations going out to the local community via the P&C and what other means that the schools have of engaging with the community now, all that's going to help. I mean, I see it as an evolution, I guess. funding obviously is always going to be a huge hurdle in getting this sort of stuff happening. And I think the other thing that I mentioned, that this sense of complete overloading of schools that are constantly being asked to do everything. There a lot of people would have to be convinced that this is a good thing for them to be doing. There's, you know, just quite a, I think, quite a legitimate attitude that schools need to stick to their knitting, their core business. So people who, and that's quite an understandable view for people to have. So that, you know, if this concept is going to thrive, then those people would have to be convinced that this is their business, that this helps them do their business. And so
absolutely. So Janet, you've been in the midst of all of this. I'm sure you've got some great insights and some very practical ideas potentially for individuals that might have, such as Holly, that might already be sold on the value, but they want to know how you do this. What are the things that they should be thinking about?
And I think that's a really good segue, because with the Building Connections project, what we've actually done is built a how to hub framework and a journey map. And the very thing that Harold and John have talked about is the idea of you have to get inspired, you do have to sell the value. And I would argue you need to do that within your school and say, look, we're going to do this because look at the benefits, and inspire the staff and start and bring the school community on the journey. But first and foremost, once you've promoted that value and that idea, and you may just be the lone champion in the beginning, but once you've got that sown the seed, here's what we've got to do, you do have to think about infrastructure. You do have to start this development journey, which is building those relationships, but making sure you've got the resources to do it. I think the human resources first is the critical factor, and then talk about, you know, what is that actually going to look like in terms of, you know, who do we need to speak to? And most importantly, you start reaching out to the community. That in itself is going to add value, because, you know, you've got to listen to your community members. And as I was saying, so you've got to understand community's needs. And then you've got to understand whether you as a school, community as a school, is ready to dive in and do this and get the resources. So I think it's, you know, the evidence base that you've heard, and then you start sharing the vision and building the relationships. Then you've actually got to get real and think about, you know, developing the how you're going to do it, the operational plan, and getting involved.
So Janet, one of the things that John pointed out was certainly that even those people involved in community hubs, their first thought was all the barriers. And I suspect for teachers in high school situations, their first thought is, oh my God, this is just more. I'm going to have to juggle more things and more people and more thoughts. How do we help allowing the teaching staff and the admin staff within those situations that this is actually something that can be managed and probably has a positive impact on their work, rather than another overloading of fun ideas that maybe may or may not actually help them in their work.
And I think that's what you just said is the critical one. The notion of the fun ideas. Wouldn't it be nice if we do this? It'd be lovely, it'd be good. Most importantly is these are the benefits that we've got to make. So rather than just add something on top, we're going to embed it. We're going to make it part of that process. We're going to make it part of the school ecosystem. And so we're not, look, it is going to take some work. No question, it is going to take some resources, and it is going to require, and Harold will know about this, of assuring that you're getting some funding. And so that's where you're bringing in not only the community, but we think about policy. We think about our education, departments of education, and all around the country, this on their radar. So it is working across all of those, the philanthropic groups, community, and departments to come together, government coming together and saying, okay, a principal, I would argue, needs to be really nifty in terms of the funding and the way that they use the resourcing just to get it going, because it requires you to come up with a plan. And this is the hard part, I think, that still maintains the overarching purpose of a school, particularly in a secondary school.
Yeah. Thank you, Janet. Harold, I was going to ask, because one of the questions we had was, what do you think the role of local government can be as a participant or as a school partner? So given the environment in which you work, what is the role of local government?
I haven't got a good answer to that, as we have had very limited involvement from local government in our hub. We occasionally will have someone from local government in to explain, part of what they do.
Yeah.
So
I'll tell you an idea, certainly where I would like to see this, and this is certainly not at the beginning stages, but the idea that local government might be reviewing elements of its strategic plan, or even might be thinking about naming the local park. The idea that those questions that local government has could come to forums that are created between students and parents and other community members in the school environment, I think is a wonderful opportunity to actually maximise this use of brains in those spaces. Is that something, Harold, that you think could be utilised?
Definitely. And I think local government could form a crucial part of what we do, because again, going back to my village model, they're part of the village and they have a real role in ensuring that there are a whole lot of facilities available for every member of the village. So I think it, and I'm talking off the top of my head because this isn't a path that I've gone down, but I think that it would be quite useful to have them on board in terms of supporting what we're trying to do when we build those community relationships.
Yes, absolutely. Now, John, I'm not sure whether this is a question that you can help with, but there was a question as to whether or not there was already a difference at the community connectivity level between different types of secondary schools, so government, faith-based, independent schools. Have you come across that in the work that you do more broadly, that there are, so do you think Catholic schools, for instance, are more connected into their communities than, say, independent schools might be, and is government schools different again?
Yeah, well, I'll start out by saying my expertise isn't in this space, but I would have thought undoubtedly in another life I was actually a part of a Renaissance musical troupe, traveling around schools, and I really noticed the difference between the Catholic and the state schools. Yeah, and I'm sure that sort of difference resounds in all sorts of ways.
So some of them already have a different philosophical basis in which to start to think about broadening out into greater engagement with the communities. Janet, is that anything that's come across your path?
We just completed a national survey inviting schools to, talk about schools as community hubs. And if I'm honest, we really didn't see any difference across those jurisdictions, because it's all about what you just said, which is the difference in that mindset to start.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter where you are, but if you start with a mindset that we as a school are very much a part of that engagement, whether you're independent, secondary, Catholic, whatever, that's the critical thing. And I'm sure there are some, once you dig through the evidence, you'll find individual differences within one community in relation to the Catholic school, independent school versus the public school. But across the board, not really.
Janet, just while I have you, there's been a couple of mentions. One is, did you mention a how-to hub framework?
Yes, and I've just sent the link to the Scan Hamlin Foundations Institute, so hopefully they'll share that. You can actually just Google Building Connections project, and there's a whole website, and what you'll find there is the How to Hub framework plus a range of different translation of the evidence that we found so far in different things that you can do to support schools building community hubs. So thinking about urban planning, thinking about facilities, which are really critical. I'm going to argue evaluation and evidence gathering, infrastructure.
I was just about to ask you that. So it's got some, there is some advice there on how to do monitoring and evaluation frameworks.
Yeah.
Fabulous. Now, just while I have you, Janet, I just wonder if you might mention just briefly the American experience, whether or not that has resonance here, or is the Australian context different to that?
Yes, the Australian context is very different. So number one, but in the US, you can have 52 different contexts that you're working in. You just have to understand that, the US is very variable. Now, they have wraparound schools. John mentioned New York. In the early 2000s, Josh Klein was working so hard to get schools as community schools. So there is a big burst in the US across all communities, some language-based, some health-based. Grow Your Own, for example, is a health-based community school. Now, the interesting thing in the US is it's the longitudinal nature and the exposure of the student to and community to that environment, to that mindset that's having the impact. But if the student is only in that place for 2-3 years, then you won't see the impact. But you'll see more of an impact on community at a broader level. So we talk about local government, governments generally changing policies. You can't, we would argue, you're not going to see the change that perhaps some of our policy makers in education, health, justice, etc., would want to see in a 3 to 4 year period. It's just not going to happen. But
really
you see things at community. Yeah, you need that longitudinal nature. And that's what we're learning from the US.
Excellent. Now, given that we haven't got too many minutes left, Harold, I wondered whether or not, given that we've just talked about impact, you might share a couple of anecdotes with us around how have you recognized the impact that bringing students, community, parents together has actually had, and that you think perhaps would occur in a secondary school environment as well?
Okay, I'll start with the one that John quoted in the report around my kinders coming in. Historically, when we have kindergarten, so that's our first year of school, students coming in, and particularly if they're coming with a very limited background in English, it's a really traumatic experience. They are clinging on to mum. They don't want to go. There's all these strange adults, there's all these strange different kids. Because we run our hub sessions right in the middle of the school, and in fact, next door to kindergarten classes, and because we have childcare there, while mums do English language lessons, and they're not formal lessons. They are joyful, get in and dance and sing lessons. So those sessions alone mean that the kids know it's a safe place. We make sure that they have little excursions, that they meet some of the teachers. We also make sure that I, as the man in the suit and supposedly the scary one, that everyone meets me and recognises that I'm actually not scary at all. I dream of that. But so those kids come into the school owning the place. They are so confident. There is none of that hang on to mum. It's a really smooth transition. The other one that I'd just like to mention is one that happened last week, in that we have learned to swim classes once a year for over a week, and it's sort of a run with specialised instructors at one of the local pools. And we work very, very hard to get our called community involved in that, because we're so close to the water here. And most of those families and those kids have no exposure to swimming as a recreation, to water safety. So for us, it's critical. It's a life-saving option. And so we, after the first day that those kids went, and there were 60 of them, with the very next morning, our community hub coordinator had contact from two different mums, saying there was an issue with the instructor who was forcing the kids to go into the water when they weren't ready. They were terrified. And to the extent that, you know, one of our little boys was absolutely refusing to go back. It meant that we could be really proactive around that we were able to get in touch with the instructors, or the coordinator of the instructors, that we got in touch with the mum and said, this is, we're following up on this. We talked to the little boy involved. He agreed that if one of our teachers went with him, and the teacher was going anyway, but if he went with him and looked after him at the pool, he would go again. He did.
Yeah.
So both those kids went back. It just means that we can be so proactive in supporting those families and those kids.
And able to cut issues off before they blow up into something
Yes.
much bigger.
Yeah.
So thank you, Harold, for sharing those. It's really tremendous to hear about those sorts of very practical outcomes for the individuals that are attending the schools. But I do want to encourage everybody who's listening today, and I want to thank everybody for having attended this session. It's tremendous, and I really appreciate everything that's been contributed by John Young in the chat. That's been very, very useful indeed. I want to thank everybody for listening. I hope it's actually inspired you to think more about what we might do in our secondary schools, and to think more broadly about what the opportunities are for them to be so much more integrated into our communities. It's really important that we allow everybody to feel like there is a way for them to participate and to get that sense of belonging that both Harold and Janet and John have outlined. It really makes an enormous difference. So thank you, everybody, very, very much for having been a part of this session. And thank you, Janet, Harold and John in particular, and Faisal for having organised all of this. So thank you all, and I hope you have a pleasant afternoon. So thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks very much.